Hello, my name is Phoebe Chan. My name is Hannah Chan.
And my name is Joseph Heitzman, and the title of our performance is Caged But Not Defeated, the Triumphant Spirit of the Angels of Bataan.
Sir, you want to see me?
Yes, there will be no surgeries today. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, and high command is convinced that the Philippine Islands are next, and we will be the first target because Baguio is the most important military and commercial center in the entire northern Luzon province.
What do you mean? Is the hospital truly in danger? Surely the Japanese wouldn't bring the ordnance to the upcountry coast.
I'm afraid that there's no telling what was there.
On December 8th, 1941, one day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese dropped their first bombs on Baguio. War had come to the Philippines.
Prior to the Japanese invasion, U.S. troops were stationed in the Philippines as a defensive measure. A group of Army and Navy nurses, who would later come to be known as the Angels of Bataan, were also stationed on the island of Luzon.
Initially, the Philippines was a place of paradise and adventure for us nurses. However, once the Japanese dropped their first bombs on Luzon, this once seeming paradise turned into a tumultuous land of horror and tragedy, thrusting us into the combat zone. Ultimately, we saved thousands of lives in the 4 years spent in the Philippines. We became the first group of U.S. women in combat. Casualties flooded into once considered sleepy little hospitals. We nurses were left to manage the damage and the loss. There were patients everywhere. We had to lie them down in the tennis courts and lawns.
After Baguio, the Japanese bombed several other major U.S. military bases to the ground and invaded Manila, forcing the U.S. troops to retreat into the peninsula of Bataan. The plan, called War Plan Orange, was to defend the northern border of Bataan for as long as possible.
In time, however, we were forced to fall back to two hastily developed field hospitals deep in the jungles of Bataan, right before Lemay was bombed to the ground. Their conditions were severely worse. We were forced to work in tents with little to no equipment. We became the first group of U.S. women in uniform to be assigned service in the combat zone.
Each field hospital was equipped to treat about 1,000 patients, but both ended up treating over 5,000. Patients were convalescing in open-air wards in the humid jungle, and diseases such as malaria and dysentery ran rampant. Despite these horrible conditions and the constant Japanese bombings, the nurses continued steadfastly in their duty of tending to the sick and wounded.
Have you heard any news from your fiancé? No. No one has seen him since the fall of Manila. But I can't worry about that now. There are thousands of men outside suffering from malaria. Where's the quinine? Here, this is the last of it. The doses will be too scarce to do much good. The malnutrition is aggravating the effects of malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever on the men. MacArthur recently cut down the portions to 1/4 of a ration. That is less than 1,000 calories a day. The quartermaster just butchered the last 250 calorie courses. I'm needing surgery.
We will start by debriding the chest wound.
Take off your gloves and gowns. We're leaving. No, I'm needed here. The defense line to the north has been lost. Bataan will surrender tomorrow. We're being evacuated to the island of Craig, or take what you can carry and prepare to leave. Walking outside, in the middle of an operation, with hundreds of men lined up underneath the trees, waiting for surgery, was devastating to me. Their eyes just followed me.
Once the peninsula of Bataan was lost, the nurses were forced to retreat to the final fallback location, Malinta Tunnel on the island of Corregidor. Malinta Tunnel was an underground fortress and bomb bunker, equipped with a field hospital.
If you want to know what the darkness in Egypt felt like, you'll find out in Malinta Tunnel. When the bombings occurred and the generators would go off, it was so dark you could feel it. We were bombed every day by the Japanese. The number of casualties increased, and the wounded began to pile up. Underneath all the bombings, it was all a very gory mess. General Wainwright would like to see me in his office.
General MacArthur has fled to Australia and left me in charge of the Philippines. But he will be sending 2 planes filled with food and supplies, and there will be enough space for 20 nurses to be evacuated. You will be in charge of deciding who gets to go.
20 nurses were chosen out of a hat and were able to flee Corregidor. The rest were left wondering, why not me? Attention nurses! I know that some of you are suffering from painful water blisters, malnutrition, and malaria, but be focused during this 18-hour shift. We have a duty to our patients. Unit 1, you'll be tending to the patients sick with upper respiratory infections, malnutrition, and dysentery. Unit 2,
May 4th, 1942, the Japanese launched a brutal attack. In under 24 hours, over 15,000 bombshells fell on the island, completely obliterating our defenses. On May 6th, I, General Jonathan Wainwright, surrendered Corregidor to the Japanese.
As the American flag was being lowered down, we nurses wrote our names on this bedsheet for documentation, just in case we disappeared. The Japanese shipped off thousands of captured U.S. soldiers to prison camps. We nurses were kept separate from the men and sent to Santo Tomas, a civilian internment camp in Manila. How could they prepare us? For there's no precedent of women nurses being taken prisoner.
The nurses were admitted into the Santo Tomas internment camp on July 2nd, 1942. They were the first large group of American women to be taken prisoners of war. The camp was filled with over 3,000 internees, but even though they were prisoners, the nurses' duty was still first to their patients. They set up a large field hospital within the camp and continued tending to the sick and wounded.
We treated patients with malaria, beriberi, and other diseases. Life was pretty monotonous, and it was a constant struggle day to day to exist. We only received 105 calories a day and were near starvation, but we worked the entire time we were interned, fulfilling our duty to our patients. How's your shift? I checked on Mr. and Mrs. Williams before I left the hospital. Mrs. Williams' fever has finally gone down. But Mr. Williams, his colitis, it's so far advanced that I don't think he'll be surviving the night. We've been here for 3 years now. At least half a dozen people are dying each day. There's no food to eat. It's like the Japanese are waiting for us to die off. We've already been there. The reason that we are alive today is because we have a purpose, a duty to our patients. We give up this purpose now, it would all have been for nothing. Tanks are crashing through the gate in Centerville. Our boys, they've come!
On February 3rd, 1945, U.S. troops liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp. We found 3,785 internees so emaciated they were walking skeletons. But not a single nurse died in the camp. They lost over 30% of their body weight, which is the same as the American male prisoners of war. These women, who had triumphed in the face of tragedy, were among the first Americans to return home.
After they were liberated, the nurses were sent to hospitals to recover. Once able, they were given leave to return back to the U.S. and to their families. Eventually, they all began to slip back into American society.
However, the traumatic events that the nurses experienced in the Philippines left many of them with serious mental and physical health issues. Some lost the ability to bear children, while others suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health conditions.
For 40 years, the U.S. government and military refused to acknowledge the inspiring role that the nurses played. They failed to use their valuable knowledge and experience as the first large group of female prisoners of war to prepare for future instances. The nurses were also denied veteran rights because they did not fit the government's ideal image of a veteran. They were square pegs trying to fit into round holes.
Beyond this, the nurses were first-hand victims of the U.S. military's blunder in the Philippines. War Plan Orange was doomed from the start, and the government wanted to suppress anyone who posed a threat to the heroic narrative that the U.S. was trying to produce after their victory in the war.
The nurses were kept in the dark for many years until they were finally brought into the limelight. They were invited to the 1983 POW MIA Recognition Day, had a plaque dedicated to them, our surviving servicemen in Bataan, and many of the nurses were awarded distinguished military awards. Upon their recognition, women across America were inspired by their story and took up nursing for the U.S. military. Today, 16% of active duty personnel are women. In 2013, the Pentagon lifted the 1994 ban on women serving in ground combat units after an ACLU lawsuit argued the women were already serving in combat roles but were not getting recognized. The Angels of Bataan were used as an example in this lawsuit. This change also made women's service in combat official, acknowledging their contributions and sacrifices.
These 77 women were a groundbreaking force in the Pacific Theater. They were the first American women to wear combat uniforms, the first American nurses to be assigned duty in the battlefield, and the first group of American women to be captured and imprisoned. They endured tragedy during and after the war, but
they persevered, they persisted, and they triumphed in the end. We spent our lives helping people, but we did it with honor and love and never looked back.